It's sickening to think you couldn't come home from doing a bit of shopping and to have... And he meant to do it because he went for my arm with both hands. You know, if it was an ordinary shopping bag. I've had it for years, leather, with strong handles. But, you know, he wrenched it out of my hand.
Did he hurt you?
No, he didn't hurt me, but I was absolutely stunned. I couldn't believe it. And then I gathered myself quickly in a second and took chase after him across grass. You know, I couldn't go very fast. But I thought if only I could keep him in sight, I could say to somebody, he's got my bag, stop him, you know. But, of course, just at that time, there was nobody about. But you see, I'm worried about my Barclay card and the money. I'm worried. Tom said, don't worry, but I am worried.
Well,
and there's the key of the door. You see, I've lots of little things in my wallet. I can't remember what was in. You know, little photographs that are treasured things, you know, and they're nothing to him, you see. I would have given him the money. Not willingly, but I would have given it to him to get my bag.
Okay. Obviously, we will leave now and obviously have a look around the town centre. So there are other officers who are
well, he was going
looking
up
at the
towards
present
the
time.
shop, up the steps.
Cops and robbers make dramatic figures. Television's love affair with both has meant little attention has been paid to the less glamorous figures squeezed in between, the victims of crime. They don't dash about to the sound of sirens, an effect you won't hear again in this film. Each year, some 900,000 people have their houses burgled, and 120,000 assaults take place. Some 650 people are murdered. All these crimes leave practical and psychological problems. But while Starsky competes with Kojak and politicians beat the drum for law and order, victims find they've become part of the paperwork in what experts call the criminal justice system. Rape has already received much attention, so this film looks at how the police and the courts deal with other crimes. First, we followed patrols in Birmingham and Preston to see how they handled victims.
So it was locked when you went out?
The most common offence the police have to deal with is burglary. For officers, break-ins become routine. For each victim, his crime is at best a nuisance, at worst a tragedy, as Rita and Chuck Bailey found out.
They've been upstairs in the bedroom, tipped a few stuff over the bedroom. You know, it's terrible. Just fitted lotion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bought me rings, Chuck, me engagement.
It's all right.
What time did you go out?
It's 10:09.
9, and you've got back at what time? Just about
10. Yeah.
10:05. Right. So they've come through the front door.
They haven't gone out the back, the back door's still locked.
The back door's still locked?
Yeah.
Where else have they had a search, you know? This is the one.
Your wardrobe as well.
The police need to find evidence. The victims need to find time to recover. The priorities are very different.
And there, what that?
There's about 7 or 8.
Can you see anything that touched on there?
No, just
What
that
else
there.
have
must have
just
touched
taken them
that.
off the top.
Yeah, it just fits them all
rings
over
on
that,
it.
you know.
Oh, I see.
They've been in that. That's open.
What are your feelings now looking at your bedroom?
Wish I could catch them. The police wouldn't do it, I would do it.
Well, we walked through the door, and when I shut the door, it wouldn't shut properly, and I was pushing it, thinking, you know, something was stuck, and then when I looked at the lock, it was all hanging off, like, you know. And then until we walked in the living room, we seen all the plants in the corner, all messed up, and...
We haven't been out for an hour, though.
We never left till 9:15.
Yeah. Come on, don't be silly. Hey, don't be silly. Come on.
In Birmingham, the police cooperate with local victim support schemes, which offer practical and emotional help. But the man on the beat decides whether or not to call them in.
The couple there aren't so bad because the husband seems decent sort of a chap and he's going to look after his wife. really, there's no need for the victim support scheme in that case. You know, any counselling is not going to be of any benefit to those sorts of people.
Yeah.
Whereas we got other residents like Erdington, especially in King's Standing, with their aged population, where they need some counselling because it's quite a frightening thing for them.
For the crew of the fast response car, it's important to deal with each incident as fast as possible to be ready for the next job. Chief Superintendent McKay of the Preston Police.
I think the truth is that they are busy, they are chasing from one job to another. But it doesn't mean they've not got to be compassionate. They've got to look upon people as though it's their mother and father and treat people as they would want to be treated themselves. To care for them, to ask questions, to not necessarily give them the impression that we're going to detect each and every crime. I don't think the public expect that. But I do think they expect to be treated in a reasonable manner and to be shown some care and to have some thought for the difficulties they're in at that time.
I mean, once you've sorted out the insurance, security, maybe the repair of locks or doors or whatever it may be, that is then done. But you've still got the feelings, which might go on for months. And I think if people can be put in touch with feelings straight away, then maybe it helps.
Preston Victim Support Scheme.
Victim support schemes provide such help. Volunteers visit the day after a crime to give advice on how to handle insurance and compensation, and also a chance to talk through the emotional problems being burgled often leaves. In Preston, unlike Birmingham and many other places, the police refer all victims of crime to their local schemes.
Most people we would meet say, oh, I didn't know such an organisation as yours existed. I am glad. I feel if there's somebody who goes along and basically says, I'm sorry, I care. Just as simple as that. That carries a lot of weight and helps the person move from the position of being a victim to that of a survivor.
Ironically, a major task for volunteers is to prepare victims for how the system is likely to treat them.
We say to victims, you probably won't hear anything. And I think most of societies resign, oh, well, people are just too busy, they won't come back to us. Although we often say to the police, if you do hear anything, if there is a court case, if someone's caught, will you please go back and tell them, or will you please let us know and we'll tell the victims. But it's a sad loss, actually. I think people would gain a lot of confidence and feel there was much more of a two-way relationship if there was more comeback that way.
The police spend their day dashing from crisis to crisis. That means that victims like Winifred Jones, whose money, Barclaycard and pension book were snatched, often don't get followed up. We went back to see her 3 weeks after she'd been robbed.
We were told that someone would call, but no one came and no one has been since. I'm amazed to think the police have not been back. Or I am really amazed about that. I think officialdom is very cold.
What about the DHSS? What happened in your contacts with the DHSS?
Well, I rang them up to tell them about the loss of the book, you know, which is important. You have to do that. And I did say, could someone come to the house to see me, and I could explain it all to them. But they said they were sorry. No one could come. They were very short of staff. And I would have to go there. And so Tom's daughter came, and she took me. She has a car. And she took me, and we explained it to them. But I don't think they were very interested, really.
Financially, what did they do?
I had to wait 2 weeks before I got any money. We've heard of people's knees knocking. Well, that's what happens to me, you know. All of me starts to shake. It's a reaction, you see, isn't it? You know, I've been a widow for 12 years, and I've had to sort of manage on my own, and I've never been a nervous disposition at all. I used to do voluntary work at the hospital and walk home at 9 and 9:30 at night when it was dark. I've never been afraid at all. But now I don't want to go over the road even to post a letter unless Tom will come with me. You know, I completely lost my nerve.
One reason that Mrs. Jones may not have been visited again is that she wasn't injured and lost less than £400. That makes her not much of a priority in police terms. Keeping victims informed is also a low priority, according to a 3-year study by Dr. Joanna Shapland of Oxford University's Centre for Criminological Research.
The victims, we re-interviewed them several times, in fact, over a period of between a year or 3 years. And we found that their impressions of the police declined significantly, and they were very much less rosy at the end of the study than they were at the beginning. And the reasons were lack of information and attitude of police officers.
What's your full name?
We commissioned Dr. Shapland to carry out a national survey of how both the courts and the police deal with victims. 80% of police forces replied. All agreed that victims needed considerable help and welcomed victim support schemes. But senior officers couldn't be sure how well that message got through to the men on the beat. Training remains patchy, especially in the CID. Only 33% of forces have written material to give to victims about their rights. Only 25% of forces refer all victims to support schemes. Most, like Birmingham, leave it up to individual officers to judge if such help is needed. In 1984, only 20% of those burgled saw anyone from victim support. We went back to the Baileys 3 weeks after their burglary, when the police had decided they could cope on their own.
As soon as any of them, like if Chuck went out at all and I was there, I was always listening for the slight noise, and I mean, we've put extra locks on the door, and I'm always making sure all the locks are bolted now. And when I go out shopping, I'm dreading coming back in case, you know, I open the door and they've been in again, like, you know.
Are you surprised by how much it's affected you?
I am, to be truthful. I am really. You know, I'm not soft and normally, am I?
No.
We was insured up to about July, and it had rocketed that sky high because I class Erdington as a high-risk area. And with Chuck being out of work, we couldn't afford to renew it.
It's killing us about £90, I think. Gone from £23 to about 90 quid.
So we're not insured anyway now.
We was thinking of moving in a couple of years' time, for definitely. Just give Joyce a bit more time at this special school he goes to. But now the way he's picked up, we'll give him another 6 months, we'll probably be gone from there anyway. More or less. Just depends.
So the burglar is a kind of, gives you the final reason for going?
Yes, it's really made the decision for us, like. I don't feel safe, I must admit.
Well, I think if I ever found out who it was, I'd break his fingers with a sledgehammer or something. I'll make sure he'd never do it again. Definitely.
Four months after their burglary, the Baileys moved. The police, the legal system and the rest of us treat some offences not so much as crimes, but more as mere accidents. Burglary is bad, but most of us commit motoring offences. The campaign against drunk driving fights against such attitudes. It was founded by retired police superintendent Graham Buxton. One night, his daughter Annette didn't come home. He went looking for her with her sister Helen.
I said, what vehicles are involved? I said, is it an orange Mini? And, you know, I asked them if it was an orange Mini, and they sort of wouldn't say at that stage. They didn't really, you know, I think they didn't really want me there, so they sort of walked back to the car with me.
I guess something was terribly wrong. I could see the shocked look on Helen's face. Then when the policeman came to the car, he said that it was my daughter, Annette, and that she'd been killed in the crash. They'd called a doctor to the scene, and Annette had been certified dead then, and we were just devastated. I can honestly say this, I've dealt with tragedies during my life, but I've never ever been so frightened in all my life. I just didn't know what to do.
Frightened?
Frightened, terrified. You know, I'd never imagined that it could happen to one of my own like that.
You just can't sleep. You don't know. You wake up in the morning and you think that everything's going to be okay, and it isn't. And there's sort of an emptiness in the house. It's... You can't really explain fully, can you, exactly?
The family were looking to me for support. You know, they thought I should have been able to cope with this type of situation. But I felt so inadequate in the circumstances. It's something I thought I knew what people were going through when this happened to others, but no way.
Because you'd been a policeman?
Because I'd been a policeman and I dealt with these sort of tragedies. After the initial happenings of the night, the process of the law moved into action, and it was very slow to start with. And we inquired as to what was happening. We wanted to see things happening. We wanted to know what had happened. But there is an air of secrecy as to the actual circumstances, and we were left, it was all a mystery to us, in the dark. We didn't know exactly whether Annette was to blame, whether someone else was to blame. And it was some time before we actually established exactly what was going on.
As an ex-policeman, Graham Buxton had some idea of how the system worked. Most victims can't be expected to. Chris Turner is a plumber who was walking his dog when a gang attacked.
I was sort of surrounded. I was in the middle of a circle, and they just laced into me with the sticks. Within a second, I suppose, I was on the floor, and they were just hitting me all the time with the sticks.
The Preston police immediately arrested one man who admitted the crime.
I, of course, asked him straight away what about the others. But he seemed quite content that they were, you know, they had one who admitted everything and they couldn't picture any difficulty getting a conviction. And I thought that was disgraceful because they were most definitely involved. My injuries couldn't have been done by one person. I mean, I found out since this man who was convicted was only about 5'2", and there's no way he could have inflicted all that harm on his own.
Did you make the point to the police that you were angry that they were only going to prosecute one person?
Yes, I did.
What did they say to that?
Well, I was offered one or two explanations. He said, well, we appreciate they were involved. We know they were involved. They knew all the youths. He said, if we had them up in court, all of them up in court, say we had 6 of them in court, one of them admitted it, the other 5 would be going in court denying it. He said they would all blame one another. One would be up and say, well, it wasn't me, it was him. And he said that would be hopeless and they could end up without any of them being convicted.
Initially, we were told that the driver, who was a drunken driver and well over the limit, had been driving on his wrong side of the road, and that he was just going to be charged with drunken driving, driving with excess alcohol, and careless driving. And I thought, well, these are rather trivial offences for taking a totally innocent life. But even at that stage, we were powerless to do anything because we hadn't heard the evidence. And it wasn't until the inquest took place that we were able to go and hear what the evidence was. And at the end of the inquest, a verdict of accidental death was brought in, which I found quite unacceptable, having regard to the circumstances. And it was at that stage that we felt we must act to really do justice to our daughter. She'd been totally blameless. Her life had been taken. And my wife went to see the Assistant Chief Constable of West Mercia and said, we're not satisfied with the proposed charges. And we asked him to send the file to the Director of Public Prosecutions.
But for victims, going to court can prove even more of an ordeal. For the police, Saturday night is violence night, when too much drink can easily turn a pub crawl into a pub brawl.
We ain't done nothing wrong. Go on, please. Find out who's done wrong.
Each year, Britain sees over 120,000 assaults. The physical and psychological consequences can damage lives. Chris Turner came out of hospital with his foot crippled.
From working continuously all those years, I'm now, well, I'm an invalid because I'm on an invalidity pension, and that's what I am, in effect, an invalid. Without a doubt, I'll never be able to do a lot of the work I used to do because a lot of my work involves roof work. We do an awful lot of sheet lead work, and I'll never be able to do that again because eventually I have to go back in hospital and have this plate put into my foot which will make it rigid. And there's no way if my foot's at 90-degree angle will I be able to go up a pitched roof again. So I'm resigned to that. I'll never be able to do that kind of work again.
The scars can be deep. Colette Dupont was not badly hurt when a Birmingham post office was raided in July '84. After a week, she went back to work there. A year later, there was another raid.
I was trying to scream, but it's a bit difficult to scream when you've got a hand held against your throat.
You must have been very frightened.
And I was very frightened because I kept thinking, you know, well, is he or isn't he?
What, going to...
Well, going to, you know, actually, I mean, I could feel this knife on my throat, you know. I thought, I didn't move. I thought if he slips or anything. And then after a while, when this other fellow wasn't making much headway getting through, still hanging on to me, he started ramming into the door, you know.
Using you?
Using me as a, yes. Because that was all black and blue, you know.
Yeah.
He let me go then. And I mean, I was just, you know, shaking. I just sort of propped myself up against the wall and they got the money and they fled.
You know, she hadn't been hurt or injured, and I thought, okay, fair enough. Enough a bad experience. I said, I think you ought to call it a day now. And it was only later, I think, that we both realized that the second time, although she wasn't physically actually hurt, was much more serious than the first.
When the police came in, he said, well, you're making a habit of this, aren't you? You'll be getting immune. And I said, no, that's it. I said, I'm not coming back anymore. And I didn't go back in to work after that day. Matter of fact, I've only been back in the shop the once. And I didn't feel very good then. So I haven't been back. And that's since last July. I think you could sort of shut yourself away quite easily. I think you have to make the effort and say, you know, I'm going to go out there and face all, because, I mean, you go through a phase when you think everybody's against you. You know, why should I have to give my job up? Because of this, you know, it seemed unfair and, you know, seems a very poor reason to have to give up a job.
We found that it was impossible really to predict who would suffer the most, if you like. And it might just as well be a young male victim, or particularly someone was assaulted at work and who then had to go back to that same work. And that might particularly be, for example, bus drivers, taxi drivers, shopkeepers, licensees. You realise it can happen, you're frightened of it happening again. You feel you ought not to be so frightened, perhaps. You feel you ought to be able to go to work, particularly a man, and support your wife and children. And you can build up a whole set of interacting worries and conflicts and problems that can get worse and worse.
Either somebody came between 2:30 and this morning.
Victims of crime can sometimes get compensation. The government's Criminal Injuries Compensation Board does pay out £35 million a year, but it's slow and bureaucratic. Claims can take over 20 months to settle. And for all the law and order rhetoric, for every £1 the state spends on offenders, it spends just 3p on victims. The total sum the government gives to all victim support schemes is under £1 million. And if victims or their families claim from insurance companies, They usually don't get sympathy, but hard bargaining.
It is difficult for families because nobody wants to make a profit financially out of losing someone in these circumstances, and it's almost abhorrent to think of it in that way. And all families, I'm sure, do consider this to be a real problem. It is our view that insurance companies realise how vulnerable we are, and they take advantage of it. They will make paltry offers in the knowledge that victim families will want to be rid of the money side as quickly as possible, and accept because of that vulnerability. But I stuck out in our case for the very reason that I've mentioned. I considered myself fighting for justice for Annette. Right at the very last minute, they did make a settlement, which was nothing like that we felt they should have done. It was a paltry settlement, but more than they were initially prepared to offer.
In theory, the courts should be most sympathetic in dealing with murder victims and their families. The Coleman family tend the grave of 30-year-old Tony. He was killed on the night of August the 17th, 1984, by his wife, Pauline. At 7 a.m., the police came to the house Mrs. Coleman shares with her daughter, 50 yards from where Tony became the victim of a domestic crime. His sister Anne met them.
When I came down the stairs and they introduced themselves who they were, and he just said, "Tony's dead." I just looked at him. I just went quiet. No reaction whatsoever. I don't know whether I was in shock or what. When I got through to Margaret, you know when you put a record on the wrong speed, that was the reaction I got on the end of the phone. How do you tell your family that your brother has been murdered? I said they were the worst phone calls I have ever had to make in my life. I asked Sergeant Taylor how he died, and he wouldn't tell me. Sergeant Taylor went, I asked this other constable how he died, and he said, "I'm just sorry." He said, "I can't tell you." He said, "It's domestic."
We were given no details by the police. They were cold. They just informed the family of the news and left. And we didn't know who to go to, who to turn to for information.
I didn't know how my son died until on Monday morning we went to the court.
To the inquest?
No,
we
went out and we didn't know anything about the inquest.
You didn't know anything about the inquest?
No, until I picked the Bootle Times up and read it in the Bootle Times.
So the police didn't even tell you there was an inquest?
No.
We asked the police for his belongings, and we were fobbed off many, many times, and we pressed the point, and we contacted a solicitor, and we were told that whatever effects had been left belonged to his next of kin, which was his wife.
Sometimes even the body can become the subject of legal wrangling, as Ned Wilde and his family found when his son Michael was killed trying to stop a gang fight. The problem sounds macabre, but it is routine.
The most important, of course, at the time was trying to find out when we could have a funeral. Those acting for the defense were not prepared to release the body to let us have a funeral. We were given to understand that they wanted to conduct another autopsy or several. And in fact, it was over 6 weeks before we were allowed to take the body for a funeral.
What kind of effect did that have on you and your family?
I think for his widow and for the younger members of the family, that was probably the most distressing time of all. Because there's something psychological about having a funeral. At least it's a stepping stone on the way. And nobody could do anything. Nobody could make any arrangements. It transpired at the trial that no one had conducted another autopsy. In fact, the defense pathologist produced his evidence from the photographs, the police photographs of the body taken in the mortuary.
What did that make you think that your family had been...
Well, it made me a little bit annoyed because we could have had him there and then.
Would that have made a difference?
I think so. I very much think so, because after an event like that, everyone has to eventually get on with leading their own life. And this just held everybody up.
Even when there is national sympathy, families face more than the ordinary traumas of bereavement. At Seven Kings Station, Peter Burns, a 59-year-old ticket collector, was attacked and left with a 7-inch spike in his eye. It made headline news. The first his family knew of it was at 1 in the morning.
I looked through the window, and the detective showed me the pass and said, "Can you come in down, Mrs. Byrne?" And I ran downstairs, and he said to me, he said, "Sit down, I've got something to tell you." And I said, "I won't sit down, tell me what happened." He said, "But your husband been insulted and he's in the hospital." The doctor take me to the office and tell me all about it, which my husband is very ill, which he's very, very sorry, and brain damage, and Tammy was telling me that, and that fix him in bed. And when we reached there, we couldn't believe what we were going to see, and Peter was shocked, and I hold his hand, was enough feeling there, and
Must have been dreadful.
which was just a machine. It wasn't him, he wasn't alive for me anyway. For all them 9 days I was with my mum, comforting her as much as I could. And as soon as we heard that my dad had died, I just went upstairs. I couldn't cry or nothing, because it was such a shock. They had to get the doctor in. I went deaf, and now I didn't know what I was doing with the shock I had, you see. I would lie in bed thinking of my dad. And like, it was very hard trying to sleep. Like, me and my brother Chris, we shared the same room. We'd sit up talking all night about my dad, how nice he was to us, and things like that.
Did that help you at all?
Yeah, well, to talk about him in nice ways was, well, like, it would make you think, like, that my dad's only sitting in the, sleeping in the other room next door. But then when you wake up in the morning and he's not there, just makes you think, how did it happen? Like, 'cause we weren't there to witness what happened, but then you keep on thinking.
Victims often want to know when any trial is on, but even in major cases, it's hard for them to find out. The Burns family asked the police specially to give them as much warning of the trial as possible. Bernard Burns.
We got a phone call, I mean, not even a visit, we got a phone call telling us that the actual court will be starting the next day at 9 o'clock, and if we want to, we could be there. That is the only way that we found out.
So you had no previous...
No previous. We were told.
And it was
we did ask them to let us know in good time so we can take days off work or we can arrange for whatever we needed to do, but we got a call the day before. I mean, late evening as well.
It's a system which really doesn't see you necessarily as a very important person. It doesn't think it needs you. In fact, it does, very much indeed, because victims report the majority of cases that get into that system. They are the ones that indeed detect a majority of the offenders that are processed through that system, and they're very necessary to give evidence at court if that should be required. But the system doesn't seem to realise that they are that important. It tends to ignore them, leave them aside, not tell them what's going on, not consult with them over important decisions.
Courts were designed to impress, grave arenas where justice is handed out. Ironically, and not very justly, the victims may be more impressed than anyone else. Our legal system is like a game with special rules. Outsiders, like victims, can't hope to understand them. They feel at a disadvantage from the start.
We arrived at the court that morning, to the new courts, and it's quite a daunting experience for any member of the public who's not used to law courts to walk into a building like that and to walk into a crowded waiting room with barristers and solicitors and people all over the place and to be confronted by the criminal with their family. I just didn't think that sort of thing could happen, but I realised she hadn't been charged.
No, she hadn't been found guilty then.
She hadn't been found guilty then. And so we sat facing each other, which was a dreadful experience.
On the night of August the 17th, Pauline Coleman complained to the police that her husband had battered her. The police said she was drunk and sent her home. It was only in court that the family finally learned just how she had stabbed him.
She stepped over the body and went down the stairs into the living room, which was quite a distance, and then further into a kitchen, and got another knife and came back upstairs and cut his throat and cut him in so many places. I've lost count, really, of what. We heard that for the first time about 9 months later. We'd lived in that hell of nobody telling us how he died or what happened.
I didn't know how Tony died. I knew it was a knife, but I didn't know how many knives. But when I heard of the second knife, I had to get up and walk out. Couldn't sit and listen to anymore.
We went to the cafeteria in the courts, and I couldn't believe that there she was again, with all of her family. We couldn't eat. We had some coffee. We couldn't have a meal. We were beyond that. And there they were, all sat, eating a huge lunch. She had a lunch. And as we had to walk past them, we couldn't avoid it. Her brothers were there, and they laughed.
It is impossible for a layman not to think of it all as a great circus. Everything moves at a very slow pace. There are an awful lot of people there. It's very difficult to establish what they're all doing, or why they should be there. It's certainly a most unsympathetic environment for bereaved people to be in. And it doesn't help to see some of the counsel there asleep at times. Perhaps they do it so often, I presume, that after the end of that trial, they all moved on somewhere else, to another pitch. They are certainly very impersonal. And it doesn't help the bereaved one bit.
Court procedures baffle most witnesses. Usually no one has explained that a trial can look not just like a search for the truth, but more like a fencing match. So the defense has to outscore the prosecution. One good tactic is to discredit prosecution witnesses, even if they happen to have been the victim.
When you go to court, I think they should perhaps warn you of what's going to happen.
Procedure.
I mean, you wait outside in the hall. This is at the Crown Court. And then suddenly they call your name, and you go through a door, and there you are, right in the witness box. Which is a bit of a shock sort of thing. I mean.
And what happened when you first got in the witness box?
Well, they ask you your name and where you live. And again, I presented that a bit, asking your address. I mean, because the gallery was full of friends of this chap who was sitting in the dock. But I think you feel very vulnerable, sort of standing there and having questions fired at you. And you come away almost feeling guilty yourself, because the the fellow who was asking the questions, you know, he keeps on saying, well, how did you know they were coloured? I mean, you tell me they were masked, you tell me they had gloves on. If you couldn't see their skin, how do you know they were coloured? And it's this sort of thing.
The environment is perhaps confusing, but most of all, perhaps they are not really aware of the type of questions that might be put to them. The victim perhaps walks into the court expecting some kind of special treatment. The truth is that so far as the court is concerned, in a not guilty plea, before they've decided upon guilt or innocence, the court must treat every witness that they hear on equal terms. The victim is not entitled to be believed any more than any other witness. Now, victims are often quite unaware of that. They expect special treatment, and the court is unable to give them special treatment.
For our survey, we sent questionnaires to all the magistrates' courts in England and Wales. 43% replied. It seems very few facilities are available for victims. Only one court out of 264 had a waiting room specially set aside for them. Only 9 courts had interviewing rooms for victims or prosecution witnesses. No court had separate catering facilities. In 84% of courts, the victim would have to sit in a public gallery, possibly next to the accused's family. The attitudes of clerks of court were mixed. 54% did think victims should get more help, but 27% thought victims only interested the court if they were witnesses, and 21% thought any help would be unfair to the accused. In only 17% of cases would courts know for sure if a victim was present at the trial. Most serious cases finally end up at Crown courts, and though we sent our questionnaire to all of them in England and Wales, too few replied for us to analyse the results properly. In Liverpool, the Coleman family waited for the judge to sum up in the case against Pauline Coleman.
In the courtroom, he constantly expressed his concern about her and get her a cup of tea. It is quite an ordeal for her, and ordered one of the ushers to bring her some tea. She was very composed. She didn't look as though she was going through any ordeal. And the constant looks from the judge to my family, especially to my mother, not an ounce of compassion. I think it would have helped enormously if somebody in the court had at least put their arm around my mother, shown some concern, directed her to a chair. But we were just treated as though we had no right to be there.
For families of murder victims, one of the most painful experiences is to have to listen to the defence argue that death was somehow deserved. Pauline Coleman's defence relied heavily on her having been battered by Tony. His family have never believed that's true and resent the fact that they had no chance to say what he was like.
They made him as an animal in the course, and my brother wasn't an animal. My brother has a personality as big as Liverpool. He loved people, he loved old people, and he loved his mother.
Peter Burns's family had to listen to evidence that he had provoked the fight.
I was supposed to be called up as a character witness on the part of my father, which I think would have helped our case quite a lot, because they never knew nothing about my dad, what he was like, what type of person he was. I mean, OK, I might have got up there and said he was the best person on the earth, and he could not have been, but at least they could have seen his side, what type of person he was. And for him to actually kick somebody, spit on somebody or fight with somebody, it's not him at all. It's not his character. He's not that type of person.
Once the defendant has been convicted of an offence, then the court's primary duty is to sentence the offender, and they take into account what has happened to the victim as part of the circumstances of the offence.
But that's only part of what the...
Part of the complete picture, which will eventually result in the court deciding upon appropriate sentence. The victim is a consideration, but there are other considerations: mitigation, aggravating circumstances surrounding the offence outside the immediate victim.
But even courts can fail to spot loopholes. The drunken driver who killed Annette Buxton was found guilty, but while probation reports were prepared, he was not only let free, but allowed to carry on driving.
We were faced with a situation for the following 5 weeks when this man convicted of killing our daughter was driving up and down in the vicinity of our home, and I saw him on at least 5 occasions during that time, which I found really quite devastating.
For the court, the right sentence is a complex calculation. For the victim, the right sentence has to reflect the havoc caused to them.
I was quite shocked that he only received a sentence of 6 months imprisonment, 3 months of which were suspended for 2 years, and he was disqualified from driving for 3 years. When you compare that sentence with the sentence available to the court, that is 5 years imprisonment and life disqualification, it seemed to trivialise the whole matter.
Chris Turner also hoped his attacker would get a severe sentence.
The court was told he had a £12,000 a year job, and since the trial, I've been told by numerous people who should know that the reason he did get away without going to prison was because he had a good job. Now, I had a good job, but I can't work. My source of income stopped dead. He's still drawing his £12,000 a year. He's paying me £100 a month. He should pay me £100 a month. He's paying me one payment in February. His second payment hasn't been forthcoming. It's a month overdue now. I mean, they're all free. I'm a virtual prisoner because I'm restricted an awful lot in what I can do. I'm restricted to the house, more or less. And I think I've come out of it very, very badly.
I was really waiting to see how long she would get, what sentence she would get. And then I heard the judge speak very sympathetically and say that he hoped that she would have blue skies from now on. And he pronounced a 2-year probation order. You may leave the court and go home with your children. I couldn't believe that. I stood up and shouted to the judge, has anybody cared about his mother? Does anybody show any concern about his mother? And then I apologised to the court. But that to me was British justice.
What did the judge say?
He looked at me very patronising at this point and said, I understand how you feel. How the hell can he understand how you feel?
Bernard Burns also objected, both because the crime was downgraded to manslaughter and because the sentence was too short.
The judge ordered me to be taken out. As soon as I got up and I started shouting and telling them that how I felt, he ordered me to be taken out, and I was taken out. And apparently, when they had actually given the verdict of guilty to manslaughter, the police then came out and started reading out his previous convictions. It was then that the jury realised what type of person he was, because they stood there, and I was told by my friends and my brothers who was in there, they were actually shocked when the police told them exactly what he had done in the past.
There is no attention at all focused on the victim family. There are no facilities offered to help victim families when they suffer a terrible tragedy as we have done, or in any circumstance. And this was most apparent at the court proceedings. This man was given legal aid. He was provided with a solicitor, with a barrister. Social inquiry reports were made to help him. The probation service were there to help him. At no stage, other than friends and our local vicar, has anyone come to us in any capacity with the specific task of helping the victim family. And there is a terrible need in this respect, because in a situation like this, the victim is just as important as the accused.
In her case, she's had the backup of the social services, the probation services, the housing services. She's had a new house. She has custody of the children. I feel quite really angry at society that the victims, meaning my mother, my sisters, my brothers, have had no one. We've tried everywhere to get some help. My mother yearns to see those two children.
We don't exist, really. We just take it each day as it comes. And if we get through that day, well, that's a good day. And then tomorrow, we just see what tomorrow brings. We get support from one another. I said that's all we want to do, is just be together and talk about it.
Well, I know I've gone very quiet. I just don't want to be bothered with anybody. I used to talk to a lot of people when I go down to the shops, but now I don't. Just walk past them. Why, I don't know.
I hope there's an end to this anger, because it's not something that you can cope with. If I think I've got to live with this for the rest of my life, I couldn't do it. I've got to find some way. We've all got to find a way.
I'll try to forget that he died in such a way that it had to be called murder. But then it just comes into your mind, doesn't it? When you try to think about him in a pleasant way. It just comes to mind that someone had gone and done that so that this would happen to him.
Now, sometimes I'm going just in my bedroom. If I had to cry, I cry, and never stop thinking that's what's get me down. But I'm on sleeping pill. I'm thinking same thing over and over every day. I can't say I've been wake up one day, I forget things, but it's not.
There's no end to it.
There's no end to it. No end to it, no.
As she had already received £10,000 from British Rail, the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board awarded Mrs. Burns only £600 to pay the funeral expenses. In its anxiety to be just, our legal system gives the accused many rights. This film isn't a plea for harsher sentences, but for more care, money and imagination to be devoted to victims. They also deserve justice.